Good afternoon. Thank you so much for making time for this interview. We really appreciate the insights that you're going to share this afternoon. Could you please introduce yourself, describe your work, and the impact you're trying to have through it?
So my name is Jessy Appavoo, and I am the Regional Engagement Manager for the C40 Cities Finance Facility. And the C40 Cities Finance Facility works closely with cities to access finance for climate-compatible urban infrastructure, to lower their emissions, and or to build climate resilience. We are trying to overcome the urban infrastructure finance gap that has been created by the fact that on the one side, cities are faced with an enormous challenge to plan, develop, finance, and implement climate actions. And then on the other hand, you have the financing community, the investor community that is unwilling to commit finance without the sound documentation or proof of concept put in place. So that's where the CFF comes in, where we provide technical assistance to cities to develop the technical studies, business models, cost-benefit analysis that are required to attract finance into infrastructure projects. So as a project preparation facility, we bring projects to finance-ready stage. We are currently supporting 19 projects in 17 cities, and 5 of these projects are in Africa. We've got projects in South Africa, Tanzania, and Senegal. And the CFF is a joint program between C40 and GIZ. In terms of the impact that we are trying to have, is we're really trying to shift financial flows towards climate-compatible urban infrastructure, which would be in line with the 1.5-degree pathway of the Paris Agreement, so that we can safeguard the lives of millions as climate impacts intensify in the future.
Thank you. And from your experience, what would you say are some of the key opportunities or barriers to cities being able to access climate finance?
Well, there are several barriers, and they are of different nature. For instance, you've got the market and governance barriers that limit cities' ability to access finance and shift those financial flows to climate-compatible urban infrastructure. If I were to summarize them briefly, there are 3 main barriers that come to mind. There's the one on capacity. So addressing climate change is rather a new challenge for cities. And they have limited capacity to package climate actions into projects that resonate or speak the language of the investor community. What that does is creates a chasm between climate actions and where the pot of money really sits. So when we start packaging climate actions as finance-ready or bankable projects, that's when we start seeing the shift in financial flows towards the much-needed climate-resilient urban infrastructure. I'd like to add at this point that it's really not the lack of finance, it's the lack of bankable projects. So until we can demonstrate to the investor community that there is enough scale, that there are enough pipelines for climate resilient infrastructure, we will not be seeing those shifts in financial flows. So it's really a capacity issue around packaging climate actions into bankable or finance-ready projects. In terms of the governance side, most national governments have devolved responsibilities to cities over many policy areas, and that also includes climate change. But cities really lack the financial autonomy that would allow them to finance their infrastructure that is needed to deliver services to their citizens. So cities have also limited upfront public capital to finance climate actions. And generally that would be off their balance sheet. But given the existing backlog, especially that we're seeing in service delivery, the disproportionate impact of climate change, which leads to more public funds being depleted to recover climate-related disasters, we're seeing that cities have less and less funds to be able to deliver climate actions. The third one is really on the market side of things. So the international finance organizations, banks, and funds are generally structurally unable to provide finance to cities directly. And that support is really required for cities to tackle the challenges of climate change. However, the current climate finance architecture is really biased towards the interface with national government. So there's the inability to channel finance directly to cities that may be most able to respond to the actual needs of their vulnerable citizens. And also international climate funds are a really important way of delivering finance for climate action, but they're generally really difficult for cities to access. So that is really a key barrier that we really need to overcome if we really want to be seeing financial flows into cities for them to be able to implement their climate actions. You also mentioned opportunities. So in terms of opportunity, the one that I would really like to mention today is the fact that there is a lot of support going around in terms of supporting cities to develop their climate action, whether it's in the form of plans or to finance them or to implement them. And I would really encourage cities to really tap into all of these opportunities that are available to build technical and financial capacity at the city level. There are a couple of project preparation facilities, such as the C40 Cities Finance Facility, and other programs that are trying to bridge the urban infrastructure finance gap. So I would really encourage cities to really tap into those opportunities to make sure that they build also the technical and financial capacities that would allow them to be able to deliver on the climate actions that are really required to build climate resilience within their own cities.
Thank you. I think you've mentioned a number of important barriers to acknowledge across different scales, and also that which is within the control of the municipality, and actually where other actors need to really come in and play a role. And I think we'll touch on that a little bit later. But how do you see the immediate response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the longer term response that is currently being considered actually impacting on these barriers and opportunities?
Well, the impact of COVID-19 pandemic, as we all know it, is huge. Just as a result of people losing their livelihoods, I believe it's estimated that about 100 million people living in cities globally are likely to fall into poverty, with as many as 71 million falling into extreme poverty. So more so than ever, there is a need for cities to deliver climate resilience at an accelerated pace to increase the resilience of communities that have been made far more vulnerable to future climate shocks. So with depleted municipal coffers as a result of the funds that have been diverted to COVID-19 response, that coupled with dramatically less municipal revenue, in addition, we have a contracted global economy. Cities will need more support to prioritize, design, and implement low carbon and climate resilient infrastructure. There are going to be even more barriers in a post-COVID world, and cities will need to navigate through an even more complex financial arena to access finance for their climate actions. But there are also opportunities for cities to work towards a green recovery from COVID. For instance, investing in projects that are not only are climate resilient, but take into consideration co-benefits such as job creation or improving air quality. So what we're seeing is that a lot of the barriers will be felt more acutely, but there are also opportunities that are emerging if cities latch onto a green recovery to COVID.
Thank you. And how do you see multi-level governance being an enabler for improved climate finance?
So it's a very good question. Improved multi-level governance can have a really profound impact on cities' ability to access finance. It is an enabler to cities having access to the financial resources that will allow them to deliver on their climate commitments. The financial resources needed can come from a range of sources, from national government to development finance institutions, multilateral development banks, or climate funds. So improved multi-level governance would allow cities to have more control over their own budgets that will help to bust the myth or perception that they are not credit worthy. That would allow cities to have a sound financial track record to receive support directly from financial institutions, be it local or international financial institutions, and also to access debt financing on international markets. Currently, many cities rely on local financial institutions that may or may not have the capacity to help them finance the large-scale infrastructure projects. Sound multi-level governance would also enable cities to deliver on the primary function, which is to provide services to their citizens, of which climate resilience is one of those key services that cities need to deliver to their citizens.
Thank you. I think in terms of what you've said, you provided really tangible examples of the benefit of multi-level governance, because I think sometimes we can speak about it in broader terms, but in terms of being able to take greater control of your kind of the financial narrative that's being shared around your city, I think that issue of creditworthiness, I think, is very important, because a city, it can be hard to have a full sense or full representation of your financial resources available if they're actually sitting in multiple pots in across different levels. So yeah, that was really valuable to hear. And how do you see financial mechanisms actually playing a part in enhancing gender equality going forward?
So I wouldn't say that it is in the financial mechanism itself that we can support gender equality, but it's rather in the planning of the climate action or intervention. The financial mechanism is a means to an end. So it is the end that needs to be thoughtfully planned to be inclusive and sensitive and responsive to gender considerations. There are several things that can be done. For example, gender analytical tools should be used to plan, design, and implement climate actions. Gender assessment and gender-based criteria can also be used in the ongoing monitoring and implementation of these actions. But I don't necessarily believe that it is in the financial mechanism itself that we can build gender equality, but it's rather in what that financial mechanism is going to be delivering and how it's going to be delivering that.
Thank you. And so moving now to reflecting on or identifying some of the key actions that can be taken. What are the actions that cities should take themselves to enable a greater kind of ability to absorb finance that is available, but also to be able to access more finance for climate infrastructure?
There are several things that cities can be doing to actively overcome the barrier and, like you said, to absorb some of the finance. The first one that comes to mind is really cities should be packaging their climate actions to attract public and private finance. There are several project preparation facilities out there that offer this type of support, of which the C40 Cities Finance Facility is one of them. So that would be key in really unlocking the pipeline, unlocking the scale of finance that we really need to see flowing into cities for them to be able to deliver their climate actions. The second one is around cities should actively engage with development finance institutions and multilateral development banks for them to understand what kind of bespoke financial products they can tap into to fund their climate actions. Like we discussed a little bit earlier, a lot of that finance is just not accessible to cities, but there might be some financial tools or products that can be tailor-made for cities. So there is the need for cities to actively be engaged and be in a conversation with those financial institutions to understand what is it that they can tap into, what type of pot of money that they can tap into, and using what financial product. The other thing would be around cities looking into building their credit worthiness. That would unlock a whole other pool of finance, and it's a pretty large pool of finance, which is the debt finance. So cities should be actively working on building that credit worthiness, and I think that's a really pivotal part of ensuring that finance flows into cities. There's also another one, which is more around cities sending a very strong signal to the market through the form of policies, strategies, or plans, such as the climate action plans that C40 is supporting cities to develop. And what that does is that plan, strategy, or the policy sends a very strong signal to the market that highlights what their priorities are going to be for the next couple of years. And what that later on does is it garner quite a bit of interest and help to mobilize finance from the private sector.
Thank you. And cities aren't the only actors in this space that have a key role to play. So if we think of national governments, multilateral development banks, national development banks, and the private sector, whether that is kind of traditional kind of banks or whether it's longer term investors, institutional investors, what sort of actions would you say they need to undertake to support this flow of finance to cities?
So I think for a long time, the climate agenda has been really dominated by national governments. And only recently have we started seeing cities being put on the climate agenda, having a voice in the climate agenda. But what that meant is that a lot of the processes, the mechanisms, and the tools put in place were largely developed for national governments and are really not sensitive to the context and needs of cities. So there is a real need for these financial institutions to engage with cities to co-create those financial solutions that can work for them to accelerate the implementation of climate actions for a climate resilient future. There's also a need to enter into a conversation with national governments about cities being given the mandate to plan climate actions, but they lack the required financial autonomy to bring these climate actions to fruition so that they can safeguard the lives and livelihoods of their citizens. So I see this as being several conversations that are needed and at multiple levels with the financing community, but also with national government, because there's really a need to reach financial autonomy for cities to be able to better plan and to have control over their own budget to implement climate actions.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your great insights. You've definitely kind of repackaged some of the ways of thinking or the kind of elements of the barriers and the opportunities in really interesting ways and provided new insights. So thank you. I really appreciate your time.